Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming and welcome to the 2010 Chase Peace Prize Senior Thesis event in honor of our latest recipient of the Chase Peace Prize for the best senior thesis on the subject of war and peace, Mullapudi, class of 2010. My name is Chris Woolforth. I'm the Associate Director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding, who sponsors the prize each year. I'm just going to say a few words about the Chase Peace Prize and its origins before I turn the floor over to Associate Professor of History Douglas Haynes, who's going to serve as moderator for today's event. The Chase Peace Prizes were created through a bequest in 1939 from a New Hampshire philanthropist named Edward M. Chase. He had emigrated to the United States from Lithuania, was very successful in the furniture business, and devoted his latter part of his life to various philanthropic causes, primarily related to the Jewish condition, but also was very concerned with the challenges of keeping peace in the world. His death in 1939 prevented him from witnessing the most deadly war of the 20th century, but made his commitment to peace causes all the more imperative. Dartmouth College offers two prizes each year for the Chase Peace Prize. One is an undergraduate essay contest, the winner of which will be announced very shortly. The other is our senior thesis prize competition. This prize is for the best senior thesis, regardless of department at the college, on the subject of war and peace, very broadly defined. This year's recipient, Mullapudi, won for her thesis on the Khmer Rouge tribunals, which you'll hear about more shortly. The prize comes with a $1,500 monetary prize, but also the opportunity to return to Dartmouth the year following your graduation to have your topic taken very seriously. Is appearing on a panel of experts, and her work is being treated on an equal footing with theirs. So it's an honor and indeed a privilege to have her back today. I'll leave the introductions of the panelists to Professor Doug Haynes, but I'll just introduce him. He's Associate Professor of History, specializes his teaching and research on Southeast Asia and on colonialism and post-colonial struggles. And Doug was UMA's thesis advisor last year. Doug? Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Chris. I want to thank the Chase Peace Prize Committee and the Dickey Center for International Understanding for sponsoring this event, and I want to thank Chris for doing all the work of organizing this event. I think this event is really special because, as far as I know, this is the only occasion like this where not only students get a chance to talk about their honors theses, but to be on a serious panel of specialists who talk about, who are willing to comment on and put it in some larger framework. I think it would be a good idea to stretch this kind of concept to other prize-winning theses as well. It's also a pleasure to celebrate Uma's thesis here, and I'm pleased that Uma has been able to make it here after I think it's about 6 months away from campus. I remember last year, sometime in late-ish May, she came up to me and said, I've heard about this Chase Peace Prize. Peace Prize. Do you think I should apply for that? And I said yes, but I was actually quite embarrassed that I hadn't thought of it already. At that point, I didn't say that to her, but I wasn't surprised in the end that her thesis won this prize because it was a very, very good one. Uma's thesis addresses the problem of justice for the more than 1.5 million people, about 20% of the Cambodian population at the time, who lost their lives due to the horrific policies and actions of the Khmer Rouge government during the years between 1975 and 1978. Some of these died in Cambodia's equivalent of concentration camps. Others were executed by local cadres and even local villagers in the countryside. Many others died of starvation and illness during a period when the healthcare system of the country was paralyzed due to the actions of the government. Many tens of thousands of people in Cambodia probably could be called perpetrators of these events in one sense or another. Many Cambodians anticipated that the end of the regime would be accompanied by justice against those involved in genocidal activities. But now, more than 30 years later, only a handful have been brought before any kind of tribunal, and those only recently. The story of why justice was delayed during the 1980s to a certain extent is well known. At least part of that story is well known because of the role of the international community in the United States in providing protection and support for the Khmer Rouge during this period, who were engaged in guerrilla warfare with the Vietnamese army and the Vietnamese installed government in Cambodia. But the account of why justice continued to be delayed in the 1990s and afterwards is less well known, and that's the subject that Uma's thesis really takes up here. Her thesis focuses on the forces within Cambodia, brings to light the complex internal politics and the ethically complex processes involved in the process of justice. Her thesis illuminates and a point that Alex Hinton, our invited panelist himself, made in a book published last year called Transitional Justice. I may be taking a point that he's going to emphasize further when he wrote, and this is a quote, "A key argument of this book is that justice is always enmeshed with locality, and transitional and other justice initiatives are often quite messy and often fail to attend to the critical on-the-ground realities whose truth is asserted or denied. Whose voice is heard or silenced? What did justice mean across space and time? And what interests and or structures of power drive transitional justice initiatives? It is critical to consider on-the-ground realities to fully answer such questions. Even such answers reveal the messiness of the intersection of global mechanisms with these complex on-the-ground realities." Now, for those of you in the room who may be involved in writing a thesis or some other long project at the time, Uma's thesis really embodied what's most gratifying to a thesis advisor, the ability to produce something very good through persistence and steady engagement with a body of sources. If you read her thesis, it's actually a very elegantly organized and written thesis. You might get the impression that Uma started with a perfectly designed research plan and worked steadily toward the accomplishment of this plan over her senior year. My experience is that's not usually how good theses get written. And actually, Uma did have an interesting set of research questions to begin with, but the project, the arrival of the project in its current form involved a lot of slogging and wrestling with messy ideas and material. Uma originally intended to bring her thesis up to 2008, was it? Or 7? And it's only in the last 5 or 6 weeks of the process that she realized that the interlibrary loan was never going to deliver the materials on the last 3 or 4 years that she wanted to examine. And many sections of what is now Chapter 1 were written in the context of trying to deal with this. And I actually think the thesis ended up better this way than it would have if she had continued the story further. So I think it's really a credit to Uma that she persisted during this period when it was really difficult to see what the final shape of her thesis was going to be. Now we're very pleased to have with us 2 very appropriate and distinguished specialists to comment on Uma's thesis. Alexander Hinton was the person who immediately came to mind when Uma and I first sat down to think of who might be invited to this occasion. He's the author and editor of at least 6 books, including his thought-provoking study of the Cambodian killings, Why Did They Kill? Cambodia in the Shadow of Genocide, a book that is based very seriously on interviews with members of the Khmer Rouge, including people who were actually perpetrators of violence. He is also author of editor of Annihilating Difference, The Anthropology of Genocide, Biocultural Approaches to the Emotions, Genocide and Anthropological Reader, Genocide, Truth, Memory, and Representation, and Transitional Justice, Global Mechanisms and Local Realities After Genocide and Mass Violence. So he's both a specialist on Cambodia and on the larger theoretical issues involved in the study of genocide and transitional justice. And he's currently professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Rutgers, Newark, and is executive director of the Center for the Study of Genocide, Conflict Resolution, and Human Rights at Rutgers. Ben Madley is an Andrew Mellon postdoctoral fellow here at Dartmouth, where he teaches history and Native American studies. He received education at Oxford and Yale. He studies the United States and Native America, but he's also written about genocides in Africa, Australia, and Europe, often applying a transnational and comparative approach, which is evident in some of the titles of his articles, which include California's Yuki Indians Defining Genocide in Native American History, From Terror to Genocide, Britain's Tasmanian Penal Colony and Australia's History Wars, From Africa to Auschwitz, How German Southwest Africa Inculcated Ideas and Methods Adopted and Developed by the Nazis in Eastern Europe, and Patterns of Frontier Genocide, 1803 to 1910, the Aboriginal Tasmanians, the Yuki Indians, the Yuki of California, and the Herero of Namibia. Ben is currently turning his prize-winning dissertation at Yale, American Genocide, the Californian Indian Catastrophe, 1846 to 1873, into a book. And while his real specialty is on genocide in a comparative context, he has plenty of background actually on Cambodia, having worked with Ben Kiernan at Yale University, who's a specialist in this area. So the plan here is for Uma to go first and maybe talk 15, 20 minutes, and then for Professors Hinton and Madley to talk about 10 minutes each. And they've been given free rein to talk about anything that's relevant, so they can talk not only about Uma's thesis, but on broader perspectives, putting the thesis in a broader framework. So, Uma.
Thank you, Professor Haynes, for your introduction. And as he said, my name is Uma Mullapudi, and the title of my thesis is 30 Years Later, Delayed Justice in the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, 1991 to 2004. And I completed it last year through the history thesis program. And in a broader sense, my thesis deals with the difficulty of pursuing justice in a post-conflict society, and more specifically in the case of the Cambodian genocide from 1975 to 1979. And to begin with, I'd like to share a quote, which I think, got cut off, but I will read it for you, that I think provides a little bit of context and insight into my thesis presentation. And it begins, "They tortured me for 3 months. They beat me. They removed my toenails. They gave me electric shocks in my ear. It sounded like a machine in my head. My eyes were burning with fire. I want to stay alive to give evidence, because I survived the Khmer Rouge, and if I die before the trial, what was the point of surviving?" And this quote was said by a man named Khmer, who was a survivor of the Cambodian genocide. Khmer was an inmate at Tuol Sleng prison, pictured here, and about 14,000 people entered the doors of Tuol Sleng, and only 12 people survived. Many of the people that went through there were tortured, made to make false confessions, and then ultimately executed. So Khmer was one of 12 people who survived. And I find his quote interesting for a few reasons. One, it shows the suffering that occurred during this period, at least in one aspect. Second reason I find it interesting is because it shows that Khmer would like to see those who were responsible for his suffering held accountable for their actions. And he's not alone in that wish. In a 2009 study at the Human Rights Center at Berkeley, they did a cross-section survey of the Cambodian population. About 9 out of 10 respondents said that they too would like to see Khmer Rouge held accountable for their crimes. What accountable means is different for each person, but in general, that was kind of a big theme. And then the last reason I find this quote interesting is because of the date. Khmer said this before the trial of Khmer Doig, who is the overseer of Tuol Sleng prison. And Khmer was an inmate in Tulsang when he was in his 40s. This is a picture of him now in his 70s. And he had to wait about 30 years for even trials to begin, so to start to see a semblance of justice begin. And so this brought me to the bigger question of my thesis is, why did people who suffered so much, like Khmer, have to wait approximately 30 years for justice to begin? And so I guess the headers for my slides are also cut off, but I can read those too. The big question is, why was justice delayed? And past scholarship has dealt with reconstruction and reconciliation. How does Cambodia progress as a society after a range of horrible atrocities? And other scholarship has looked at the 1980s. How did Cold War international politics contribute to the delay of justice? And so my thesis, basically, the goal was to serve as a supplement to this, looking mostly at domestic political factors, mainly interactions between two important parties, the CPP, which is the Cambodian People's Party, a socialist party led by Hun Sen, pictured left, and the Phun Sen Pek Party, which is a royalist party led by Norodom Ranariddh, pictured right. It also looks at the interplay between Cambodian leadership and UN leadership and how those interactions and negotiations also contributed to the delay of justice. And so before I launch into background of the Khmer Rouge period and just the broader, the more specific details of my thesis, I'd like to start with my overarching argument. So for why was justice delayed, I basically argue that from 1991 to 2004, Cambodian and UN leaders found it necessary to balance pursuing justice with achieving national reconciliation, creating peace and stability, ensuring human rights, and maintaining national sovereignty for Cambodia. And another point to consider is that at different times, the domestic political climate caused Cambodian and UN leaders to prioritize these other factors over justice. And so for those of you who are not as familiar with Cambodia, I'll just give a brief kind of 20th century mini Cambodia lesson, a little bit of overlap with what Professor Haynes said. But in the 1950s and 60s, Cambodia enjoyed general peace and prosperity. It was led by King Sihanouk. And this peace came to an end in 1970 with the outbreak of the Cambodian Civil War, in which the U.S.-sponsored Law Null regime decided to oust Sihanouk. And so the country went through a lot of turmoil. And during that turmoil and unrest, a Maoist faction was able to kind of gain strength in numbers. Eventually, that Maoist faction was able to defeat the Law Null regime and take over the country. And that faction was the Khmer Rouge. This is a picture of the Khmer Rouge cadre entering Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia, in 1975. And the Khmer Rouge goal for Cambodia was to create an agrarian society and basically to re-educate all people that were tainted with capitalism and Western ideals and they felt would be poisonous to the nation. And so people, regardless of age or gender, or really what they did, were evacuated from cities and sent to the countryside to work in agrarian communes. Other people were sent to prisons like Tulsang, but I think most people were sent to these communes. And there they worked under really difficult conditions, suffered from malnutrition, torture, sexual abuse. A lot of people were ultimately executed. And it's interesting because the Khmer Rouge had a very strong top-down leadership, but a lot of this crime and atrocities occurred at the local level. So that brings us into the 1980s. In 1979, Vietnam invaded Cambodia after the Khmer Rouge had been going into Vietnamese territory. And this was good in a way because it ended the period of atrocities, but many Cambodians were not happy because they didn't want a foreign government to be in control of their country. So in 1979 through 1991, the PRK was in charge of Cambodia as the de facto government. However, due to Cold War politics, the UN Security Council voted not to allow the PRK to hold Cambodia's General Assembly seat in the UN. But instead of leaving that seat open during this unrest and period of transition, it stayed with the Khmer Rouge. So basically, the UN still recognized the Khmer Rouge throughout the 1980s. So this brings me into the period of my study, which is from 1991, starting in 1991. This is after the Cold War has ended. And at this point, UN leaders and Cambodian leaders decided that their main goal was to have democratic elections so that a legitimate government could be put in place in Cambodia. So from 1991 to 1993, this was the main focus. And the UN leaders and Funcinpec leader Norodom Ranariddh thought that the best way to do this was to include the Khmer Rouge. As it had been sustained during the 1980s, it was still very strong and was still able to cause a lot of damage in the country. And so just to provide a little bit of context into what leaders were thinking, I'm going to share a few quotes. The UN chief in Cambodia at this time said that it was important to keep the door open for further negotiations and dialogue with the DK, which is the Khmer Rouge, and that he thought that was the only way to proceed. Funcinpec leader said that we accept them, being the Khmer Rouge, as Cambodians and as part of the Cambodian nation. And so at first the Khmer Rouge kind of complied with regulations and seemed to be going along with the peace process. Eventually they backed out and started to wage war, and so they became not a legitimate party anymore, which seemed frustrating at the time for UN leaders, but in the end it turned out to be a good thing because further down the line it was a good thing because it is now not a legitimate party. So from this period, basically peace and building a democratic government was the priority, and at first UN leaders and Funcinpec leaders thought that it was important to include the Khmer Rouge in this process, kind of pushing the idea of justice to the side. So elections occurred, and in 1993, 1994, a new government came into place. So the Funcinpec party had won, and interestingly, it had run on a platform of national reconciliation that is willing to integrate Khmer Rouge into society in hope of rebuilding the nation. The CPP, in comparison, had been very anti-Khmer Rouge. But things started to change in 1994 to 1998. It was a coalition government with Funcinpec leader Ranariddh and CPP leader Hun Sen both sharing power. But rather than working together to kind of help the nation progress, they spent a lot of their time trying to undercut one another's power and build their own political power. And so in 1996, Hun Sen made a deal with Ieng Sary, the leader of the Khmer Rouge forces, and basically telling him that he would give him amnesty in return for him integrating his troops into the Royal Cambodian Army, which coincidentally fell under Hun Sen's leadership. Upon hearing this, Prince Ranariddh was very angry and changed his stance of trying to reconcile with the Khmer Rouge. And this kind of went back and forth. When relationships soured with Hun Sen and Ieng Sary, then Ranariddh would come in, and there was this back and forth kind of strategic alliances being formed. And two quotes that kind of provide insight into this is that Hun Sen said in 1996, "If we can avoid bloodshed and the deaths of thousands of lives because of his leadership," meaning Ieng Sary, "we must welcome him." And a few months later, the Phnom Penh Post, a newspaper in Cambodia, reported about Ranariddh. He felt comfortable with the Khmer Rouge, and this would have been unbelievable 3 months ago. So there's this back and forth between the two parties and the Khmer Rouge, showing that the Khmer Rouge, even though not a legitimate party, still had a great deal of political influence and was able to carve a political space out in Cambodia, and its power and its wants and desires were still really important to the country, and leaders at this time were taking those into consideration. In 1998, after the series of defections from Ieng Sary, he was eventually granted amnesty by Hun Sen, and the death of Pol Pot, who was the leader of the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge was now a done party. It no longer existed. And so it seemed an opportune time for trials to occur. And so UN leadership was on board, Cambodian leadership were on board, and it seemed that negotiations would go quickly and that trials could begin. But it turned out that the UN leadership and Cambodia's leadership, which was mostly Hun Sen at this time, had very different ideas of what justice means, what the objectives of justice should be. The UN, for example, thought it's very important to stick with international standards of justice, try all top Khmer Rouge leadership, including Ieng Sary, who had been granted amnesty. And they wanted to kind of have the UN leading the way with trials because they thought that the Cambodian political system was not free enough from influence and was inherently corrupt. in comparison, Hun Sen thought it was important for Cambodia to kind of take the forefront in trials. And he didn't want to try Ieng Sary because he was afraid that trying people that were granted amnesty and and had reintegrated into society would kind of cause unrest and people to panic, and for any progress that had been made to kind of fall apart. And and he also thought that it was important that since the Cambodian genocide was a Cambodian crime and occurred on Cambodian soil, that it was important to Cambodia as a nation to take the lead. And so Hun Sen on the UN, a quote that Hun Sen said that kind of gives his point of view on the UN is that the UN will have to compromise even more. The two major obstacles in the proposal are the appointment of the judges and the appointment of the prosecutor. I don't see any way that the Cambodian government can accept a majority of non-Cambodian judges or non-Cambodian prosecutors. And a UN spokesman said later during this period that on review of the entire process of the negotiation, the UN has concluded that as currently envisaged by the Cambodian court, it would not guarantee independence, impartiality, and objectivity, which are required by the United Nations and Cambodia. Eventually, due to pressure from the UN General Assembly, the leaders of both Cambodia and the UN were able to come to an agreement to create a novel hybrid tribunal, which was a mix of Cambodian judges but also international legal personnel. And so eventually from 1998 to 2004, this was the main problem, is that the UN leadership in Cambodia had different ideas of what the goals of justice should be and different standards. And so after 2004, which was supposed to be the last chapter of my thesis when the material didn't come in, it kind of would have mostly focused on what delayed the trials from 2004 to 2010 or 2009 when trials started to move forward. And a lot of it is finding funding for such a big tribunal, getting the international community on board, and just the nuts and bolts of creating like using a new hybrid tribunal format. And so this brings us into the current tribunal status. I'm not going to say too much about that as Professor Hinton will be talking about that. But this is at the trial of Comrade Doik, the overseer of Tol Sleng. Eventually he was sentenced to 35 years in prison, which Cambodia doesn't have the death penalty, and many people were surprised that he wasn't given life in prison as a sentence. And so I don't know, people didn't necessarily feel like this was enough justice, or if this was adequate enough. Chumé, who had provided evidence during the trial, said, "I'm not satisfied. We were victims 2 times, one in the Khmer Rouge time and now once again." Another survivor said felt like it was a slap in the face. But there are future trials that will be occurring, and hopefully those trials can provide be adequate or provide some like reconciliation in the country about what happened. But just to put aside, the question of whether this justice is adequate, I'd just like to conclude with kind of a bigger picture, the bigger picture that I took away from my thesis, which is that Cambodian and UN leaders face the difficult task of finding a way to pursue justice while ensuring a sufficient mix of national reconciliation, peace, international legal standards, and national sovereignty. And that sometimes Cambodian UN leadership sometimes prioritize these factors over justice. And kind of when I started my thesis, I initially thought of pursuing justice as this like straight path, like either you want to do it or you don't. And then once kind of looking at the material and reading through newspapers, I saw that there really is a lot to consider in addition to justice, and that other factors are important to the progress of a nation. And with my thesis, I didn't come to a conclusion about who is right or who is wrong, or whether the decisions that leadership made was correct, but just kind of looking at the other factors that were involved in the justice process. And that's all I have for today, but I'd like to thank the Dickey Center for International Understanding and the Chase Prize Committee for giving me the opportunity to present my thesis research, and Professor Alexander Hinton and Dr. Benjamin Madley for coming to this event and agreeing to present. I'm looking forward to what you have to say. And Professor Haynes for moderating the event and also being a very awesome thesis advisor last year. And thanks for everyone for coming on a Sunday, a very sunny afternoon to a presentation on a thesis. So thank you.
This usually doesn't work when I do it, so we'll have to see if it. They said there's a delay. This is like waiting for justice in Cambodia. So, hopefully not that long. But this really is like waiting for justice in Cambodia. I have to see. No, I know. That does it. There it is. Ah, there we go. Thanks. Anyways, can you hear me okay in the back? Yeah. First, I'd just like to give Uma my congratulations, and maybe we'll give her a round of applause. For a job really well done. Her thesis is very comprehensive, and I'm going to make some remarks that sort of come out of it and maybe do some of the more updated stuff that's happened recently with the Tribunal. I'd also like to thank the Dickey Center and Professor Haynes for putting this together, for inviting me to come speak today. I might just say briefly a couple of comments linked to what Uma was saying. The first thing in terms of justice, right, it's a sort of a question that she raises. We have this long process that's ongoing that starts back in '79 when the Vietnamese-backed government comes into power in Cambodia. And what she didn't tell you, and you might sort of trying to plan a question to give to her, is what happened from '79 up until about 91 to 93, because it's an important period of history where literally the genocide was more or less written out of speech of diplomats, government officials, and Cambodia's seat was given, the seat at the UN was actually given to the Khmer Rouge after the genocide. So it's knowledge that people don't really know that much about. So again, if anybody wants to pursue that question, that's certainly a good one to set up. In terms of the issue of justice and things I've looked at, you read that quote, and actually that is sort of what I'm going to talk about, so I spoke too soon at that moment. But what I've been looking at in my own research recently is following the case of Doik, who you saw on the screen a minute ago. He's the first person to be tried. This is a metaphor for justice in Cambodia we're going to go with for a while, but she's hitting buttons back there, so something good will happen. I don't really need it, but it'd be good to see the slides I brought. Justice in Cambodia. So in her thesis, one of her primary points is when people think about justice in Cambodia, people tend to sort of erase a lot of the past, but in particular also tend to focus on sort of what scholars have written in terms of foreign policy, international affairs, or sometimes focusing predominantly on the Khmer Rouge period itself. And what tends to be written out of these, there we go. Hit a few buttons, it'll work. What tends to be written out of the history, though, are the perspective of the people who live in the country. It seems like kind of an obvious point that you should pay attention to this, but far too often this is not the case, especially when you get into issues like justice and human rights that are taken for granted as a quote-unquote self-evident truth, a self-evident good. They're things that we've all been socialized to sort of take for granted to an extent. But anyone who's had a course in human rights knows that this is a long history. It's rooted in specific traditions. It varies from context to context. And so again, that's an important point. What exactly do the Cambodians think? What are their concerns? Sort of moving, if you were to move this towards a book or something like that to develop the project, the thing that I would then say would be a next step is to ask, in terms of, you have civil society, so who do the newspaper reporters go and talk to at the tribunal? So you saw the two quotes by Bu Meng and Chu Mai, right? And they say they're upset. But what's going on in the village, right? What do people there think? And that history, because it's sort of hard, it's difficult to speak the language. It's hot in Cambodia. When you go out to the countryside, actually, they do have a cool breeze, but it's difficult to do research out there. But, by and large, people have not really gone out to talk to people in the countryside to ask them what justice means, okay? And beyond that, as I said, we have these assumptions about justice and human rights. How do certain conceptions change through time? This is as it shows in our thesis, it's a dynamic process and a changing one. And what I want to talk about today, briefly, since I probably have about 8 minutes left, are some, on the local level, what's going on and how is this process understood. Okay. There we go. This is Uncle San and Auntie Yan. What you're looking at is the cover of a tribunal outreach booklet. It was produced by the Khmer Institute of Democracy. And you can tell Khmer Institute of Democracy, what's it for? As the title suggests, they've been involved in civil rights since the UNTAC period. A number of NGOs, when the tribunal came about, as scholars do, as NGOs do, many people do, the funding came in to work on outreach, and a number of NGOs sort of shifted what they were doing and went directly into it. Khmer Institute of Democracy was one of them. Some of the materials that were developed are lousy. Like, no one would want to read them. This one is actually a pretty good book, right? During the UNTAC period, they had, this is a period of 1993 elections in Cambodia. You had a lot of sort of graphic books that were put together, and they resonated with the people. So these NGOs drew upon this material. Okay, it's just a little picture of the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. Okay, so this booklet begins, and again, you'll see in a couple slides that this is actually, the booklet is actually used in the field, right? The Khmer Institute of Democracy comes with a set of these pages. They're blown up, and they do it like a flip chart. So they flip from page to page. So this is literally something that you would see being used in the countryside, and you can see how it's all catered to village life. But it begins with Uncle San talking about his experiences during the Khmer Rouge regime. He remembers about how people were marched out of the villages, and lots of bad stuff happened. Here you can see he steals a crab, he was beaten. He talks about how the Khmer Rouge destroyed villages, monks were killed, and people were, it's also, I'm actually going to try and track down the person who made this, because you can see the figure that's getting kicked into the mass grave looks like him, right? So, I want to sort of figure out what the person was doing, if I can track him or her down to figure out why you have that parallel. So I can't tell you the answer to that. But the booklet in the prose talks about how all the members of his family were killed. It ends here and says, he's in the hammock, and I can't sleep at night. I have horrible dreams. So he tells the stories. Then, this is a very interesting page. One day, Ante San comes up and says, hey, this Khmer Institute of Democracy is having this outreach event. Why don't you come and see what's going on? And you can see the little symbol of the European Union right there, as well as a Khmer Rouge Tribunal poster. They have a few of those. And I believe you can see the flip chart. He's holding the book, so they'll open it up and they'll flip through the pages. But what's really interesting here is, what is he doing beforehand? Right? He's lighting incense. And he's looking at pictures of what I assume are his ancestors who died before. So this is a really interesting one because it sort of raises a basic question. And again, this issue of justice that you pursue and you talk about, sort of another question that arises, what exactly does justice mean in Cambodia and to villagers? What were they doing? So when you have the discussions about the tribunal, they took place with the quote-unquote international community, right, and Khmer Rouge and the Cambodian leadership. But this question, what was happening on the local level all this time? What were they doing? And here you have an interesting thing where he's being pulled away symbolically from what Cambodians, one of the ways that they cope with the past, and it also links into their notion of justice, giving incense, praying for the dead, and going to this new sort of modern court-based mechanism. And here it is on the next page. That's a picture of the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. Kind of interesting, they set it in paddy fields, and there are paddy fields around there, but they're highly emphasized. So this, again, in contrast to many books, is a good one. The booklet goes through and talks about the signing of the agreement. Then Auntie Yan says to Uncle San, hey, you know what? You can become a civil party. And I can't go into civil parties. It's taken me a long time. But basically, this is the civil law tradition where the people who would be split off in a civil court are conjoined. The civil parties have full rights, almost full rights, to that of the prosecution. They're there to support the prosecution. The civil parties like Bumeng and Chumai sit in the court. So she's saying, you can become a complainant here. You can become a civil party. And he's got the pin out, and this is an idealized version of what would go on. They say, hey, let's go to the court. So they get in this nice air-conditioned bus. They head over to the court. They go in. This court actually, in contrast to like the ICTR, the Rwandan Tribunal, or in the former Yugoslavia, the Tribunal, has actually a really elegant courtroom. It does actually look sort of like this. What you won't see is on your left, you would actually have the civil parties sitting in the courtroom behind the civil party lawyers, and the defendant would be over on the right. So they go there, they sit in. At one point, they say, "Oh, what happens with, why is it just trying someone like Doik, who's a senior leader?" And he has some questions, and she explains that, the lower level people aren't going to be tried. And there's the big X there, the people who killed on the ground. Instead, it's the person up the top who's saying, "Comrade, you must go destroy, completely smash the enemy to bits," on the top one. And those are the people, and that's the jurisdiction of this tribunal. So afterwards, he goes and talks to someone in the tribunal victim unit and talks about becoming a civil party. They get on the bus. They go back. And she asks him, "What happens if someone wants to retaliate against us and do bad things?" And he says, "Well, they're going to go get them and put them in jail. There's protection." And then they go back to. This is the frame's a little bit cut off here. They go back and they start talking about their experiences. And what's interesting here, when he's speaking, they talk about all the great things. He says, "Yes, I think I'm going to join." And they talk, and if you look at the images here, they're images that are linked in some sense to development and modernity. So you have, right, justice, you're combating impunity in the upper left frame. You have the scales of justice, which I'm going to return to in a minute. You have the Khmer Rouge courtroom, which is, again, why do you have a tribunal? Well, justice, yeah, but you also sort of perform modernity to prove you're a modern country, right, when you have something like a tribunal. You have a well, right? So in the countryside, part of development's to having wells, irrigation. And you have the stupa, which, again, symbolizes sort of the completion of a ritual of memorialization for the dead. The end of the book, it ends by, he says, I've done this, I'm going to join. And the last line is, can anyone guess? You probably can. Sleep at night. Bingo. That's literally the last line. Healing has arrived in Cambodia. Right? The perfect. So the tribunals delivered healing at the end. Now, there are all sorts of things because you go back to that frame where you had the two, right? You had the traditional method and you had the outreach method linking people to the court. And if we think about that again, right, you think that there's actually, it's not just bringing justice to Cambodia, as the trope says, but it's literally going in and trying to transform the way people think in the countryside. People will sometimes say, "Oh yeah, we have to listen to the people when we do outreach." But if you actually say what that means, it means answering their questions often. But in the book project that I'm working on, I'm discussing how effectively the courts come in and attempt to produce people who are liberal Democrats in the end. And one way you do that is by occupying the position of, for example, a witness, a civil party. Bumeng and Chumai are very interesting because they've been heavily socialized and trained. I was in Cambodia 2 months ago, and I was talking to Chumai, actually at Tuol Sleng. And we got to one point, so we were just kind of having a casual conversation, and he said, "You know what? The court's Buddhist." And I was sort of taken aback, and I said, "Huh?" He goes, "Yeah, the court's Buddhist." I said, "Okay, now you've been being trained all this time, and you're saying the court's Buddhist," and we went into it a little bit. But that's kind of a shocking statement, right? Because you wouldn't normally associate a modern court as, you wouldn't think of it as Buddhist, right? Which is a completely different set of values. So I want to quickly, so this is the split frame, end by just saying, that's Bumeng, okay? And when he had a day at the court, and he said lots of interesting things. One thing he said, as you can see, as he talks about, he says, do you think your wife was killed there? A number of times he said, what I really want to find out is what happened to her so I can collect soil from the place where she was killed and take it back and effectively perform rituals for her soul. This is the emblem of the court, Okay, so you see again, it begins, right? So there's an Angkorian judge on top of the UN olive branches. If you actually split it apart and you look at Lady Justice on the right, which embodies one strong conception of justice that many of us have, and you could juxtapose that then to the original image from which the Angkorian judge was taken, you can see that's actually an image of hierarchy, right? So you have the judge sitting there, but that's taken out. That illustrates an erasure that takes place. So again, if you sort of compare justice, a number of values that many of us are socialized into, justice is something that's universal, it's emblematic of civilization, it's something that can be brought, as in with the tribunal and the sort of humanitarian movement. It's redemptive, you have the blindfold, it's impartial, it's objective. And again, in your thesis, you have the international standards, right? And the international standards it's a word that comes up over and over and over again in the tribunal, and there's a lot that can be said about that. But again, people are sort of pointing at this conception of justice. Oh, I've got something racy to wake all of you up, right? Okay. So what does justice mean in Cambodia? Well, if you take the word Utatoa, right, it literally means that which is in accordance with Dhamma. Okay? So it in fact points toward, it's a Buddhist word, it's a Buddhist conception. So when you have translation going on in the court, right, you say the word justice and then you say Utatoa, you actually are talking about things that conjure up a very different set of meanings, though both are multivalent terms. This is just to show you karma, so the Buddhist notion of one of the Cambodian notions of justice that's linked to Utatoa deals with karma. So whatever you do in the present, you have ramifications of that in the future, right? So your actions now precondition your future. So here you see you have a couple that's engaging in adultery, violating one of the five moral precepts of Buddhism. And you can see on the right where you have a sexual act and then the couple is penetrated on a tree of thorns. Here you have people drinking, and drinking alcohol is viewed as a hot substance in Khmer ethnophysiology, and you see their mouths are being burned with torches. To conclude, so right before they actually had the verdict, and the verdict is now under appeal, you see Bumeng is right here. You actually had all of the civil parties. They went and did a Buddhist ceremony where you were trying to transmit merit to the souls of the dead. This is a picture of the Nekda at the court. Anyway, so just to wrap up here, so again, if we have a term like justice, if we want to do engagement with the local, as you argue in your thesis, we actually have to begin to really explore what things mean on the local level. And so what I would argue we have, in one sense, is you have a tribunal where a lot of civil society people, a lot of leaders, in some sense they're bilingual in the sense they can speak the international transitional justice language. They also know about Buddhism, right? And they're sort of transacting in both ways. You have the international community, which by and large is fairly clueless about the local set of understandings, and they're more or less irrelevant because what's really important are international standards, justice, human rights, those things that are self-evident that all countries should have. And you have on the local level Cambodians who, if you'd asked them in 1994, 1987, even 2002, do you want to have a tribunal? They would have stared at you and sort of said, what do you mean exactly? We take law and legality for granted. We watch it on TV. It's everywhere we go. Cambodian friends that I have call the U.S. The culture of law. But in Cambodia, the primary association of courts is with corruption. It's something that you absolutely want to avoid, and the courts are far and few between. You go through a number of different steps before you go to a court. So what you've had to have, so this is part of the reason we're in doing outreach. They're trying to produce people who actually take on the values of transitional justice, healing, so on and so forth. This story, again, gets written out of the record. I'd say by and large, it's not very successful, even though that booklet was used. So I'll stop there, and I again want to say thank you and congratulations, and good luck on your next endeavor. Thanks.
I'll have that as my image.
Okay. So the Lord of the Iron Staff is a local Nekda, and if you mess with him, he does bad things to you.
I'll be careful.
So don't violate any oaths or anything.
Good afternoon. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone who organized this event. I'd again like to congratulate Uma, and I'd like to thank Professor Hinton for coming up here from New Jersey to be with us today and share those very interesting insights, hopefully answer some of the questions that I will pose to all of us. In 1996, Gregory Stanton, the president of the NGO Genocide Watch, called the eighth and final stage of genocide denial. By this, he meant that the final stage of any genocide in the course of human history consists of the perpetrators denying that they committed any crimes. Stanton then famously added, and I quote, "The response to denial is punishment by an international tribunal or national courts." So why is it then that the best response to the denial of genocide is a legal trial? First, legal trials document criminal behavior and criminal acts. They also serve as a way to enforce punishment. So why is that important? It's important because it upholds the rule of law, which is an important piece of the fabric of civil society. It is important also because, as both speakers have already alluded to, it helps the victims of the extreme and profound trauma that is genocide to then overcome that historical trauma. That means to be able to sleep at night. Second, trials are important because they reestablish the victim group's rights, their access to the full body of law, and they confirm that legal protection and that access to judicial process, thus hopefully deterring future mass murder while helping again to reestablish the fabric of civil society. Given the importance of such processes, how was it then that punishment by an international tribunal or national courts was delayed for 3 decades in Cambodia? And how did both international and domestic Cambodian lawyers become involved in the current UN-sponsored Khmer Rouge tribunals? Uma's 30 years later addresses both important questions. First, her thesis provides a history of the multiple and often conflicting forces and characters that slowed Cambodia's journey toward punishing Khmer Rouge leaders for crimes against humanity, genocide, and finally war crimes. Her paper touches on the well-studied and important roles that international actors, especially the People's Republic of China and the government of the United States, played in delaying justice. But her central scholarly contribution is her narrative and analysis of how domestic Cambodian politics, in all its Byzantine complexity, slowed the journey toward criminal trials and circumscribed their scope. In analyzing the role of domestic Cambodian politicians, she explores both the relationships between Cambodia's political parties and the relationships between those parties and external international actors, especially, again, the People's Republic of China, the United States, and now the United Nations. I am not an historian of Cambodia, but it seems to me that her thesis does an admirable job of helping us to understand why justice was delayed in Cambodia by shedding new light on the crucial importance of Cambodian politicians' complex and frequently shifting political calculations vis-a-vis prosecuting Khmer Rouge members for their crimes. This thesis also makes a second important contribution to scholarship. By narrating and carefully analyzing the negotiations between Hun Sen's Cambodian government and Kofi Annan's United Nations between 1998 and 2003, Uma helps us to understand the origins of the complex current Khmer Rouge tribunal structure. Understanding these extended negotiations between the Cambodian government and the United Nations helps us to understand how this situation was created. So, to review, the Khmer Rouge Tribunal is composed of both international and domestic Cambodian lawyers defending, prosecuting, and judging only former senior Khmer Rouge leaders, quote, most responsible, end quote, for crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes. All other members of the Khmer Rouge and all other crimes are excluded. Now, these Khmer Rouge leaders who are, quote, most responsible, end quote, can only be tried for crimes committed between April 12, 1975 and January 6, 1979. Critics have repeatedly pointed out these limitations. Uma's thesis now helps us to understand their origins as the result of a long, hard-fought series of negotiations between the Hun Sen government and the United Nations. The scale, complexity, and moral scope of the Cambodian genocide and its aftermath mean that scholars will be studying these events for many decades to come. Thus, we will have plenty to discuss here today. But in reading this fascinating thesis, I came away with several questions that I would like to pose to Uma, to Alex, and to Professor Haynes. First, what are the ramifications for Khmer Rouge perpetrators, their victims, and all Cambodians for this very long 3-decade delay? Certainly, the passage of time has allowed many perpetrators, most famously Pol Pot, to live out their lives and die without ever being tried or formally prosecuted by a court of law. Meanwhile, the delay of trials has also meant that survivors of this horrific genocide have died without seeing justice done. What then are the other major implications for this 3-decade-long delay? The second question that I have broadly conceived is, what are the ramifications of the compromise between Hun Sen's government and Kofi Annan's United Nations? For example, what are the ramifications of including both Cambodian lawyers and international lawyers in the tribunal? Has this, for example, weakened the tribunal, or is it stronger as a result? Was this a victory for state sovereignty and a weakening of international law, or does this complex compromise defy such easy categories? What are the ramifications of limiting the trials to the specific period between April 12, 1975 and January 6, 1975? Is this effectively a grant of impunity for the crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocidal crimes that Khmer Rouge killers committed both before and after these dates? Moreover, what will be the impact of limiting the trials to Khmer Rouge leaders only, quote, most responsible, end quote, for crimes? And finally, are such limitations still necessary, as Hun Sen and others have argued, to maintain peace and stability in Cambodia today? The third major question that came to my mind after reading this excellent thesis was, what are the broadly described lessons that we might draw from Cambodia's long road to justice? And how will this tribunal and its creation shape future trials around the world for crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes? Some justice has been done. As we have heard, since Uma submitted her thesis last May, the tribunal handed down its first ruling, convicting Kamrad Doik, who ran the infamous S-21 Khmer Rouge prison. But the vast majority of Khmer Rouge criminals will never be tried under the current tribunal system. And some observers have attributed this to the focus of Uma's thesis, the complexity and changing role of domestic Cambodian politics. Thank you.
Well, we can now open things up to questions and comments.
I have a question for Uma. Maybe you can say a few words about why was the UN and what is called the international community, which is a code word for the European Union and the US, it's all invited to intervene in this process to begin with? Because most of the process of the precedent of international tribunals for what is called war crimes are either European or North American countries punishing big countries, or several, very, very rarely there are cases of after a change of a regime where one regime is bringing to trial the heads of the former regime, which is our national courts. You're talking about a very, very interesting and rare case in which the local regime did not want to have trials, but then decided to have trials together in a hybrid system with the international community, with the UN. So how did that happen?
Can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay. So I think one main consideration was that funding for a tribunal is, just acquiring funding is a very expensive and time-consuming process. And at the point when Hun Sen became interested in trials in Cambodia, I don't think it'd really be feasible for Cambodia to hold a trial on its own. Even if you think about the people who were targeted during the Cambodian genocide, it's the people that had, traces of capitalism or had Western education. So even through that process of the genocide, a lot of the legal knowledge and the people that you think a few decades later would have that, basically that structure of strong law and a good court system kind of deteriorated. And at that point, I don't think the Cambodian government could really handle such a large-scale trial. So having UN support would be extremely helpful. But there were points in time when Hun Sen became very frustrated with the UN approach to tribunals and threatened, if you don't help me, I will have these trials on my own, and try to find funding from other countries. I think one country, for example, India, was willing at one point to give funding regardless of whether it was a UN tribunal or not. But I think when it comes down to it, it is funding. Another interesting thing is that, for example, some tribunals can happen through the International Court of Justice, or the ICC, but you can only do that to try a current ruling party. And so since the Khmer Rouge are not Cambodia's ruling party, you can't try Cambodia through that method. So I hope that kind of addresses that point.
I just want to also just correct one thing. As she points out in her thesis, it was actually the Cambodian government has sought a trial for a much longer period than the international community sought a trial. So again, there was this period where history was this was written out of international discourse, and at different points the Cambodian government was saying, during the PRK regime, was saying, what's going on? Let's have an international tribunal. Why won't you do it? And there's actually a misperception that's often linked to the view that Hun Sen is hiding something. Maybe he is, maybe he's not. But the bottom line is, and then, we have a tribunal. If it's going to be 5 people, so be it. But at least we've had
one. Professor Hinton, you elaborated in great detail about the importance of what locals, so to speak, thought of what their definition of justice was. I was just wondering, could you maybe expand on what it actually is, or if you don't know, could speculate as to what you think it might be?
Yeah, no, I was trying to, when I brought up the images, first of all, to say justice itself. What does it mean in our context or different contexts? It doesn't mean just one thing, right? These are words that connote a number of different things. So what I did is I tried to take you down on one string, right, of meaning, a predominant one that's very important in Cambodia, which is linked to Buddhism. So as I said before, if you take the word for justice, the way it's translated, and as a sort of aside, I should say, translation at the court is a fascinating thing. I go there and I put one headphone on, so I get the English translation, I listen to the Khmer, and you get all sorts of different things that are crisscrossing. And I've actually talked to some of the judges about it, and they've said different things, but they say that actually when they go in conference, for example, the Cambodian-speaking judges will go and try and tell them what was really said, and they actually dialogue about this. So the records themselves, in a sense, the translation that people are reading in the official transcripts, miss all sorts of meaning. So again, if we take the word justice, right, it means that which is in accordance with Dhamma, right? And if you look at Dhamma, right, it's linked to, right, whatever you're doing, the notion of karma, right? Whatever you do, the actions in the present condition the future. So I went in this last trip, at the same time I spoke to Mai, and he talked about, the court is Buddhist, which surprised me. I talked to a monk, and I brought this up, and he was talking about karma, and actually the photo I took was from his pagoda. And I said, and he went to the tribunal, and I said to him one day, I actually met him, I known him from a conference, I saw him there, and, it's kind of striking. Some people said, oh, their monks shouldn't be at the tribunal. I said, well, why'd you go? Not quite like that. I said in a more, polite manner, because you're speaking to a monk. And he said, oh, I just wanted to see what was going on. I just wanted to know, to understand. And I said, well, do you think that it's Buddhist? And he sort of pondered. He said, well, we do have, if someone violates the morality in the pagoda, we will actually have a disciplinary group that gets together, so there's a little bit of resonance there. But he said the bottom line is that in the end, what you're doing now, again, you'll suffer the effects of it in the future. So you don't need something like a tribunal, because what you've done now, effectively, justice will be delivered through your reincarnation, your rebirth, things you suffer in the future. And again, those photos I showed, right, those were linking to you're not supposed to drink, you're not supposed to have adultery, so on and so forth, show the ramifications in the future. So those condense one meaning of justice. The Nek Da that was there, the spirit, who you said you wanted up, and then he decided to disappear. That's the Lord of the Iron Staff. And just like here, you have to swear before you go on the stand. There, the Cambodians go and they swear an oath before the Nek Da. That's called a sabat. So you swear and you say, if I don't tell the truth, all sorts of bad things are going to happen to me. So again, the Nek Da is another way, another meaning of justice, but it's a different one because this is a local animistic spirit.
I wanted to ask about this, Ben, that you mentioned this notion that we have, which is certainly become more prevalent in the past few years, but it was also beautifully illustrated in that booklet that Alex had there, of the notion that justice will bring, trial brings closure, this idea of closure, reconciliation, healing, and you'll be able to sleep at night. And the implication of that really brochure and a lot of kind of talk shows is, it does that for the person who suffered, the victim. That will bring reconciliation to the victim. And I don't know if that's true. After this trial, are the people who suffered going to be able to sleep at night? Is this going to wipe out their nightmares? I doubt it very, very much. But I think But that's the story we get, right? We're told that's the kind of point of this. It will heal. It will bring closure for these victims. I was wondering to what extent maybe this is it's kind of another stage of denial, and in talking about how this is being restricted and all the the kind of conditions that go into making this. It's kind of like this is the way we're going to close off this period, right, and put it behind us, and so we can say, okay, we dealt with it.
Well,
the society deals with it, the government deals with it, and and now we can stop and move forward. So for whom is this closure, I guess, is my question.
I think that this trauma studies field and this study of historical trauma is relatively new and is ongoing, but there have been some very interesting longitudinal studies that have taken place in the United States, the most famous of which is a study of descendants of the Armenian genocide survivors in California, tracking their behavior in terms of substance abuse, domestic violence, arrests, and sleep disorders. And one of the things that they've been tracking for, I think, something like 40 years now at UCLA is how these things map across time in relation to things like the EU confirming that the EU believes this is indeed a case of genocide, or how these things, these indices go up and down each time the United States Congress considers and then rejects calling what happened in Armenia a genocide. But actually right across the river in White River Junction at the National Center for the Study of PTSD, they're looking at these things in great detail, and so is the US VA, for example, because they want to understand how to help our servicemen and women to overcome post-traumatic stress disorder. And one of the basic components that I think everybody that I've read so far who's studying historical trauma agrees on is that acknowledging that these things actually happen and that they are real is a very important part of psychological well-being on the individual level, because very often people suppress these memories, or they're not sure if they actually really happened. So that's a long answer to the question, but I think it's a very exciting emerging field.
Well, I think you should get the first shot.
Okay. Well, I guess another thing to add is that by even, there's, you raised a good point. Is it like, who is this justice for? Is this just like going to close it and then put aside people's feelings? But I think by even just having the tribunal, it's revisiting a period in Cambodia that wasn't necessarily talked about during the 1980s and the early 90s. That the survey that the Human Rights Center at Berkeley talked about, I was reading through it, and there's a whole section about how there are people that are young children. The age scale in Cambodia is a little skewed because of the genocide, but there's a lot of young children and school-age children that don't believe their parents or their grandparents and don't think that a genocide even occurred. And so maybe by just even having a tribunal or having some formal way of addressing that something occurred is helpful for people of a younger generation in Cambodia too.
Yeah, I might add a couple of things. First, again, I think it's important to sort of see the productive work and the transformation that goes on with the tribunal. So if you go back to that booklet, which condenses transitional justice in a bunch of ways, as you suggest, you have this truncation of time and erasure of the past. Time exists in the booklet on page 1, the Khmer Rouge period, and then you jump into the present. So in fact, there are 2 or 3 pages that deal with the village life. Then the most of it's about the court, right? And you have the erasure, so it comes into this present moment. And I mean, I don't want to go on too long about this, but you could argue that it effectively symbolizes a purification ritual as you have the transformation of Cambodia and Cambodians into this post-state of transitional justice, being sort of liberal Democrats. They've internalized certain values. They're members of the international community, so on and so forth. So that's sort of one part of it. Healing. Well, what is healing? Part of the problem with transitional justice mechanisms, people go around spouting off these terms to get money, and they promise they can deliver everything, and they can't. It's a paradox, but you have to say it in one sense. But I would say there are people who definitely believe it will bring something like healing. But so what is healing? What does that mean? Well, people talk about trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder. So you see Boomang and different people going on the stand, and you have members from people who work for an NGO, TPO, come up, and they're the mental health NGO, and they go and they sort of treat them. But what exactly is post-traumatic stress disorder? So we start pushing this question. Well, again, it goes to this notion, what does trauma mean in Cambodia? How do people deal with trauma? How have they? Again, the indication from the booklet is, I can't sleep at night. I've never dealt with the past in any way. Cambodia doesn't have the stuff that you need to heal people. So all these years, Cambodians have been suffering from PTSD. Suddenly the court comes, and then at the end you get a nice healed being. Cambodians have completely different registers for understanding different idioms of distress you have to take into account. They have all sorts of local treatments that they do. So if someone is afflicted by something, they might coin, they might cup, right? Local things. They might get a massage. You might go speak to a monk. You might get some water put on you, cooling substance. You go to a traditional healer. You have all these different, maybe you'll go to a doctor. You have all sorts of things that you can do, and people have been doing this a long time. Just like that one revealing thing where you have, right, incense before the ancestors. People have been doing those ritual activities for a long time. That, again, is erased, right? It's gone. So the healing equals something sort of like post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's supposed to be self-evident that's delivered by the tribunal. So it's a good question, but it leads, again, to really complicated questions that usually aren't asked.
Okay.
Yeah, good.
So can you just talk about what would be some of the main arguments of legal scholars who say that justice should take priority over local political issues and that a trial should take place immediately after the genocide, rather than dealing with these local domestic considerations?
I'll take the first.
You Go ahead.
All right. I always think she should get the first shot at all questions. Okay. Again, so within the legal literature, which is really interesting to learn about as I've been working on this book project, again, people don't necessarily agree. There's one school of thought that's exemplified, for example, by Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, that talks about law. That's what it's about, and self-evident what law is, and a court is there to administer law. And I talked to a judge recently, and she basically, in the court, she basically said, that's what we're supposed to do. That's one school, okay? And I'd say that also is a view in terms of our folk conceptions that are widespread. You go back to Lady Justice in that slide, right? If you talk about the cluster of things we link to justice, that's there. If you talk to the majority of people working at the court, many of the people, the international personnel, or if you talk to people in the realm of transitional justice, especially early on in the field, you would get that set of associations. Within the legal field, there's also another school, sometimes called the narrative school, that looks and recognizes what might be called expressive functions, right? So what a trial does is not just deliver, administer justice, find someone guilty. And again, when we do that, you have that paradox. How can the trial of one individual stand for something like genocide? How can that be, right? Because genocide is perpetrated by a large group of people against specific groups. But law administers and makes judgment in terms of one individual, right? So that's the legalism. When some people, it's symbolic, it's expressive, right? And it's really interesting. You can see the differences in some of the judges in terms of these outreach activities. Some judges go and participate in the outreach activities because they want this to have meaning to the people. Others don't. And you talk to them, and they effectively sort of split along these lines. So again, in terms of legality, right, we have an operative conception. If you have the discourses that lead up to the tribunal, if you go back to the stuff you talk about over and over again, you say, what is justice? What do you have it? I think there's a very specific set of assumptions exemplified by Lady Justice that are operative in that literature. And again, when you have a condensed meaning, you miss all sorts of different things. But even within law, as I said before, there are different conceptions of what should take place and what the benefit of a trial is. Did you want to?
I mean, you said like, your question kind of was like, should trials occur like right away and just you should get that done and consider the other options later. I guess Cambodia is an interesting case though, because during the 1980s that wasn't really an option. And so I think part of the reason why a lot of these other factors were taken into consideration was because of that delay, and the country had gone through so much that you had to take into consideration factors that were playing out over many decades. And I think maybe if the international community was on board in the 1980s, and if there's was more consensus then, that the end result of trials and like how people react to them could have been a little bit different.
I guess one of the things that strikes me in Uma's thesis is that there are really competing ethical considerations that were involved. There's the issue of justice in the way we've been talking about it, but what happens if the pursuit of justice against members of the Khmer Rouge, at one point she's talking about the extensive pursuit of that would have driven the Khmer Rouge into more extensive guerrilla warfare, would have delayed the peace process, and so on. So that the issue of whether justice in the sense that international agents were calling for it should be pursued, had to compete with these other kind of very serious considerations that, in fact, Uma's thesis really brought to my attention in a way that I hadn't really considered before.
I can speak loudly. I usually do. Mao's 225 is in here right now, which is a master's level course on the global diffusion of democracy. And one of the reason we're in here, we just happened to be reading last week and doing classes on last week and this week, the connection between democracy and justice, and both in theoretical terms, but also in historical terms. And we got a really mixed kind of set of messages last week in terms of justice is necessary to establish democracy. You need to establish democracy before you can establish justice. I wanted to get your thoughts on what the thinking is. Basically, boil it down to two parties in the international group that's involved there. What's their thinking about the connection between the justice that they're trying to bring about and the creation of democracy? And what's the thoughts of people in, even if it's just political leaders in Cambodia, about the connection between justice and democracy?
So I'm still processing the question, so if someone.
Yeah, I mean, again, you have these terms, and they're often bandied about as if it's self-evident what they are. And I'm sure in your class, as you begin for what is democracy, what is justice, you've seen that they're complicated questions, right? There's one sense in which these words are deployed as if they're self-evident, right? So they're used, and nobody wants to push beyond that because it gets complicated. And with this type of a tribunal, you want to get funding, you want to get people behind it, and they're thrown out as a self-evident good. I don't think they're in Cambodia. You could have, I don't know if I would call it democracy, unless we're using it very broadly, but some form that comes after the 1993 elections is operative in Cambodia. There was no need to have a trial, I think, in Cambodia. People had dealt with it in the past, largely. In some sense, I think you could argue that that effectively the international community has created a need for justice that appeared, as your thesis shows, in the 2000s. It emerges, right? It starts before. I think it was linked to different sets of human rights discourses that were in some sense activated during the UN Tribunal, where you had, some people say, what's the biggest legacy of the UN of the UNTAC? When you have the elections, people say, what's the human rights NGOs and the work that they did and continue to do on the ground. And so, if you look at this, it's really, you can see it as a continuation of that process. Is it necessary? I'd say no, you don't have to have it. Are people there glad that we're having a tribunal? If you'd asked them back in 2006, 2004, most people in countryside would have said, again, a tribunal, what exactly do you mean? Because that's outside their frame of reference. You have socialization that goes on. You get the Berkeley study, which is done much later. And through people saying, well, these people did bad things, you want something to happen to them to go to jail and be punished. If you ask that question in that sense, people say, yeah, right, it sort of makes sense. So I'd say most of the people now back the tribunal or in favor of it. Whether somehow this is going to heighten democracy in Cambodia, I don't really think so. Some people say, well, what does that mean exactly? So have you produced liberal democratic beings? Well, if Jum Mai goes through there and says to me, the court's Buddhist, right? If Bu Mang, who's gone through, been intensively socialized in human rights discourses, goes and asks these questions like, oh, I want to go get the soil of my wife so I can do this ritual. And when they ask him certain questions, legalistic questions, he's not sure what they mean. He says, can you simplify them? I'm just a poor peasant, right? If those people aren't getting it, what does that mean for the 30,000 people they've bussed into the court at different points in time for the broadcast? So in one sense, I'd say when you condense it, it comes down to, yeah, people are glad that they're convicted and something, they're going to get it, that in that sense. But whether it's successful in somehow promoting democracy, I don't think so. I think even the judges, maybe there's a long-term, now everyone's focusing on the judges, judicial reform. That's the language. It's legacy talk because we're probably just going to have 5 cases. So will the judges reform? Well, the judges are highly linked. They're 2 political parties, right? And there have been a number of contentious decisions where effectively they voted with the government, and Hun Sen has, again, as you probably followed, said, oh, we need to just have 5 cases in the name of peace, security, reconciliation, the same arguments as before. So will there be much of an impact in the long term? I think it's very much in question and maybe even doubtful.
Should I follow it up, or
sorry to be
want to go?
very careful.
Oh, I can respond after your follow-up.
Well, my question, first of all, I don't presume that the liberal democratic model is necessarily the only model of democracy. So the idea that the Shumai says it's Buddhist, that actually might be a good thing in the sense that he's rooting this process in their own culture. And I guess what I'm questioning here is there a connection between the legitimization of the new political regime, which has democratic elements in it, that's connected to this? Or do you think it just simply doesn't matter? The discussion we had last week, we had Professor Udi Greenberg asked a question earlier, And Steve Erickson, he teaches German history, teaches Japanese history in our course, was about what, one of these questions came up, what did it matter? It seemed like if you let the thing go, you let it go 30 years, generation passes, transition will happen, and the trial's not necessary. So in this case, where it's not external warfare, but internal warfare, often this is a way to bring about reconciliation has to do with trying to create grounds for democratic governance. And that's in a civil war situation where often you have different ethnic, religious identities at war. Here you don't have that, you have political differences. And I guess that was a question I wrote down earlier when you were speaking. What was the power of the Khmer Rouge that enabled them to even be considered as a party for negotiation and to still be considered seriously long after the genocide? I mean, did they have some legitimacy beyond their own immediate numbers in the country?
They had an army.
Right, exactly. They had an army.
Territorial control. I mean,
They had the threat of violence as well,
But that's not something that legitimizes that.
No.
I guess,
But
yeah, sorry, Professor Haynes, did you
No.
want? Okay. I guess that's something that's important to take in consideration with the Khmer Rouge is that I don't think anyone, even, after the 1980s and in the early 90s when they were trying to establish democracy in Cambodia, I don't think anyone really wanted to welcome the Khmer Rouge because they saw them as a legitimate, important faction, important part of Cambodia. But I think it was just considerations of what the Khmer Rouge could do, and it, like Dr. Madley said, like they had an army, and if you don't take into considerations, like if UNTAC leaders and Cambodian leaders at that time thought that if we didn't take into consideration what the Khmer Rouge were doing, what they wanted, the country could just be thrown back into war. And so even though they're not necessarily legitimate, they were still extremely influential. And after the elections, you might have democracy. The elections occurred, Hun Sen Pech won, the CPP was put in as a coalition government. That is a legitimate government, but how legitimate is a fledgling government in a country that hasn't had democratic elections in such a long time? And I think in terms of trials, what's the point? Do you need to have democracy first? Do you need to have justice? Like which is more important? Which comes first? The way that I view it is it's kind of like a cyclical process that they had to establish some form of democracy and more so a form of peace. And then by having this tribunal, I don't know if it'll have super long-term implications or that if people will be happy with the end results of that. Not all the trials have occurred. But I think it has set an important standard of accountability in Cambodia and is kind of at least making people, I guess, giving greater exposure to the legal system, the court system. In the early 90s, the Khmer Rouge were on the outskirts, but they were still targeting large pockets of ethnic Vietnamese, and nothing that they did was held accountable. People were being murdered, and people that were just small ethnic Vietnamese fishing communities were being targeted. Even I think the CPP really didn't do anything about it. And so I think by having trials, you are in some form at least showing that accountability has begun, that you can't just shoot someone or you can't just kill someone and not see some form of repercussion. And so I think that will have an important long-term impact in Cambodia.
That's a good answer. That's a good reason, actually, I think, to have the trials.
Uma or Alex, do you want to respond to Ben's questions in any way?
No, I just might get one more little thing in about on this one. Also, then, in terms of geopolitics, you had China linked to the Khmer Rouge. You obviously had, to get a settlement, you had geopolitics going on, and so you ultimately had to have the Khmer Rouge, I think, brought in. And also, who wants to continue having a group fighting? And the fact that ultimately it broke down, the reasons are not fully understood. People have different, she talks about some of the reasons in her thesis that broke down. There was a defection problem. They had a defection program. Eventually the group basically imploded at the end, right? And then you had the beginnings of people talking about this. But what I think is important, and again, maybe I'm being too critical of transitional justice, but part of the reason is because I think there's a large ideological normative weight that comes with the notion of transitional justice. What's the word? I mean, think about it. Transitional justice. You transition from a pre-state, and I would argue the implication, the suggestion is, and what's sort of assumed is a state of savagery, a failed state, a whole barbaric state. If you look at Cambodia, and you can also see this other places like Rwanda, the images you see associated with it in the media are always skulls. Or, for example, it made, I follow Cambodia all the time. The other times I've seen Cambodia make it onto the Yahoo zipper is when they got their first elevator, and of course they interviewed the one person who didn't know how to go up an elevator, right? And that comes to exemplify Cambodia's backward. And also they had a feral child who was found, a jungle girl, and she vied with Nancy Pelosi on the Yahoo top 10 stories of the week, over and over again, right? I mean, these are the stories, the representations. So again, it's really easy to sort of slip in our normative goods and assume that they're going to work in Cambodia. But I think we all need to interrogate them, and we need to ask things like, why is the history of the history written out, whereby the international community, again, depending on how you define it, turned its back on Cambodia when there were requests for, there were sanctions on Cambodia, there were requests for international justice tribunal. They were completely ignored. International community, in Cambodia, interestingly, this was used as the legitimacy of the government. They would teach kids to read and write by reading about mass murder, right? And then suddenly in 1991, 1993, it's all taken out of the textbooks. You get the situation suddenly where a generation of kids grow up and they don't really know that much about what's going on. So I'd say, what's the value? Well, I'd say one thing that's interesting, at least, is that the Documentation Center of Cambodia is bringing education back into the schools about what happened. So there'll be some things, but I also think that a tribunal is not a selfless gift. Anybody who's read the book The Gift, right, who's taken an anthropology course, reciprocity is never something that doesn't come without some sort of exchange. And I think it's a form of exchange that puts Cambodia in a certain position, even as the Cambodian elite can say, hey, we have our court, we're modern. We can go golf with the different people in Asia now, right? We're part of the club.
If I could just say, I think that was a little too harsh on transitional justice. Because it originates in the cases of Argentina and South Africa, and it isn't necessarily that conception of transitioning from an authoritarian government to a democratic government is really the origins of it. I think racism and Orientalism has a lot more to do with these responses to Cambodia than some flaw in the conception of transitional justice itself.
Well, certainly those origins, and there was more attention to locality, that I would argue. And, for example, in South Africa, you at different times, besides a token attention to local concepts, with Desmond Tutu, right, going and saying we've got to pay attention to our local understandings. I don't think that there was that much attention paid to locality, and the studies that I know of anthropologists who've worked there say that there was all sorts of stuff, local meanings that were ignored and glossed over. But also I would say the end of the Cold War and the New World Order is a huge shift. And I would say transitional justice doesn't exist before that, right? In the time you're talking about, the word with the TRC it is, but in Argentina there's no word transitional justice, right? People say it came about maybe in 1990, 91 with Rudy Teitel's work, right? Or no, maybe she even said 2000. I can't remember, but it's a very recent term. And so when I talk about transitional justice, I also think of it as in this moment of creation as an institution as opposed to something that necessarily predates it. And the question is, how is it created? You get the International Center for Transitional Justice, right? You get all sorts of people that are sort of going into the business of transitional justice. I would say there's a way in which these tribunals have a cohort of people in whose interest it is to keep the tribunals going and going to other places. There are a lot of good people working on them, but I think there are questions that we need to ask about this, whatever our view.
Thank you for being so calm.
Maybe one last question.
Do you know whether there's any cynicism in Cambodia about the tribunal, given the restrictions of its scope and the fact that parties represented on it previously made accommodations with the Rouge?
I haven't really been following. Most of my focus was prior to the tribunals occurring, so maybe Professor Hinton has a better idea of what's going on. But I think from what I was reading, it's kind of a mixed bag. Some people are really happy that something is occurring. Other people, I think there was one quote that like stood out to me when I was reading an article about after the sentence of Duch was that, you know, you could chop Duch up into 1 million pieces, but you're not going to bring back the people that passed away. And so I think that to some degree there is a little bit of cynicism that, you know, the money and time should be used for different objectives.
Yeah, I think also if you sort of look at the tribunal through time, you've had different moments at which different groups are more cynical. For example, if you look at civil society, you used to get a lot of people saying, oh, why don't you use the money and go build a bunch of roads or, you know, dig a bunch of wells. But now, you know, we actually have a little side survey of civil society, and most of those people seem to be behind the tribunal. I think people in general back at the stuff, what was really interesting is I was there the day that Duch, you had the verdict that was given. And I watched the people come out. The media is down in this room, and they're on the grass. People come out, and people run up. You know, the people in the media, journalists go and try and get interviews. You know, I know personally when I've been interviewed that I'm often asked about things, and I will talk about things that aren't of interest because it's not the story. So you have the media produces, you know, the things that we get in one sense. So corruption is a story that they want to talk about. People don't necessarily want to talk about civil parties and the significance of civil parties. But as those people came out, they went, you know, CNN had this headline, you know, like Cambodian tribunal is horrible in terms of the verdict. I can't remember the headline. I talked to the people, to the group that was interviewed, and it was a group of people from Kampong Speu province that had been brought in by an NGO. The journalists went up, and there was one person who was very outspoken and started complaining about the tribunal. Cameras all zoom in on that person, right? Well, the other people in the group, no one talks to them. Right, because the story is there. So what happens in the media, and I've watched this go, is, you know, people focus on those who are going to say sort of sensational things. You do have some reporters, they're trying to do more in-depth stories, but you want headlines. And all over, you know, CNN, you saw the headline right afterwards, along with a lot of other media sources. But if you talk to people on the ground, you get a much more nuanced sort of, you know, understanding of what's going on. I went to the village where I did a lot of work afterwards, and I interviewed people. By and large, people seem fairly satisfied with the verdict. In Cambodia, people like to speak in terms of percentages, which is a problem with these surveys, which have yes-no answers. So you say yes, no, people say no, but if you ask them what percentage, they may say, well, I'm 45% satisfied. So yeah, you have this whole way of talking. So if you actually talk to Chumai or Bumeng, and you say, what percentage satisfied are you? I think I asked Chumai that question. I think he said he's 60% satisfied, all right? So, but the headline says he's not satisfied. But he is somewhat satisfied with the process. And this goes back to the good, I think, for people like Bumeng and Chumai. Yeah, it seems to be working for them to an extent. A lot of people in Cambodia are happy. But whether suddenly you get the golden gift of democracy floating down as it's portrayed, you know, I think, I don't really think that's happening.
No, I don't either.
Yeah. Well, I think we should stop here, and people who want to talk to the panelists can come up afterwards. And thank you very much.